Late at night, when the world had gone quiet and the streets were empty, Ada would lie in her bed, listening to the faint hum of the city beyond her window. It was the only time she felt truly alone, surrounded by the comforting darkness of her room, with nothing but the distant sounds of the night to keep her company. But recently, the silence had been shattered by a series of strange phone calls that came at the most unsettling hours, when the world was asleep, and only the shadows moved. It had started innocently enough, just a few days ago. Ada had dismissed the first call as a wrong number, someone dialing in the middle of the night by mistake. She had groggily picked up the phone, mumbled a hello, and was met with silence. Thinking it was just a prank, or a misdial, she hung up and went back to sleep. But the calls didn't stop. They kept coming, each one more unsettling than the last. The next night, the phone rang again, at exactly 3 a.m. This time, Ada felt a shiver run down her spine as she answered. Again, there was silence on the other end, but she could hear something, breathing slow and deliberate. It was as if someone was listening to her, waiting for something. She quickly hung up, her heart pounding in her chest. The calls became a nightly ritual, always at the same time, always with the same unnerving silence. Ada began to dread the nights, knowing that the phone would ring and she would be forced to confront that eerie silence once more. She started to lose sleep, her days spent in a fog of exhaustion and anxiety. One night, determined to put an end to the harassment, Ada decided to speak to the caller. When the phone rang, she answered with a firm, "Who is this? What do you want?" For a moment, there was only silence, but then a voice, a deep, distorted voice, whispered her name, Ada. Ada froze, her blood running cold. How did this person know her name? Who were they, and what did they want? She felt a wave of fear wash over her, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Who are you?" she demanded, but the voice only chuckled, a sound that was both sinister and mocking. Over the next few days, the calls grew more frequent and more menacing. The voice began to reveal things, details about Ada's life that no one else could possibly know. Her childhood fears, the nightmares she had as a little girl, the secrets she had never shared with anyone. It was as if the caller could see into her soul, picking apart her deepest fears and insecurities. Terrified and desperate, Ada confided in her best friend, Unplugged. They sat in a cozy cafe, the bustling noise of the city outside providing a stark contrast to the darkness that had settled over Ada's life. Unplugged listened intently, her brow furrowed with concern. "This isn't just a prank," she said, her voice low. "It sounds like someone is targeting you." Unplugged suggested going to the police, but Ada was hesitant. What could she tell them? That she was receiving creepy phone calls in the middle of the night. That the caller knew things about her that no one else did. She could already imagine the skepticism in their eyes, the dismissive nods. But Unplugged was insistent. "You can't just ignore this, Ada. You need to find out who's doing this." Reluctantly, Ada agreed. She went to the police, but as expected, they were skeptical. They took down her information and promised to look into it, but she could tell they didn't take her seriously. Frustrated and feeling more alone than ever, Ada decided to take matters into her own hands. She started by tracing the number, but it was always blocked or unlisted. She tried recording the calls, but the voice was so distorted that it was impossible to make out any identifying features. It was as if the caller was always one step ahead, always in control. One night, after another disturbing call, Ada decided to confront her past. The caller had mentioned things from her childhood, things that she had buried deep in her memory. She visited her old neighborhood, hoping to find some clue, some connection that could explain why she was being targeted. As she walked the familiar streets, memories came flooding back, her childhood home, the playground where she used to play, the old oak tree where she and her friends would meet after school. But nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Nothing gave her the answers she was looking for. Then, she saw it, the old house at the end of the street, the one that had been abandoned for as long as she could remember. The windows were boarded up, the yard overgrown with weeds. But something about the house drew her in, a feeling of unease settling in her stomach as she approached. She remembered the stories the other kids used to tell about the house, how it was haunted, how strange noises could be heard coming from inside at night. Ada had never believed in those stories, but now, standing in front of the house, she felt a shiver of fear. Ignoring the voice in her head telling her to turn back, Ada pushed open the gate and walked up to the front door. It creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a dark, dusty interior. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, and the floorboards creaked under her feet as she stepped inside. She had no idea what she was looking for, but something told her that this house held the answers. As she explored the empty rooms, she felt a growing sense of dread. The house was silent, but there was a presence, something unseen but undeniably there. In the corner of one room, she found an old, dusty phone sitting on her table. It was an antique, the kind with a rotary dial and a heavy receiver. As she stared at it, the phone rang, its loud, shrill tone echoing through the empty house. Ada hesitated, her hand hovering over the receiver. She knew she shouldn't answer it, knew that whatever was on the other end would only bring more fear, more questions. But she couldn't help herself. She picked up the receiver and brought it to her ear. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. For a moment, there was only silence and then the voice, the same distorted, chilling voice she had been hearing for weeks. "I'm closer than you think, Ada," it whispered, the words sending a jolt of terror through her. She dropped the receiver, the sound of it hitting the floor echoing in the empty room. She had to get out, had to leave the house and never look back. But as she turned to leave, she saw something in the corner of her eye, a figure standing in the shadows watching her. Ada's heart raced as she stumbled out of the house, her mind reeling. Who was the caller? How did they know so much about her? And why were they targeting her? She ran back to her apartment, locking the door behind her, but the fear didn't go away. The calls didn't stop. That night, the phone rang again, but this time Ada didn't answer. She couldn't bear to hear the voice again, couldn't bear to know what the caller would say next. But as the phone rang, she realized something: there was no escape. The caller was always watching, always listening, and no matter where she went, they would find her. She unplugged the phone, hoping that would stop the calls, but the silence that followed was almost worse. It was suffocating, filled with the weight of her fear and the knowledge that the caller was still out there, waiting. The next few days were a blur. Ada tried to go about her life as usual, but the fear was always there, lurking in the back of her mind. One night, as she sat in her living room, trying to distract herself with a movie, there was a knock at the door. Her heart leapt into her throat. It was late, too late for visitors. She crept to the door, peering through the peephole, but there was no one there. Just as she was about to turn away, the phone, now unplugged, rang again. Ada's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't possible. The phone was unplugged, yet it rang with that same airy tone. Summoning all her courage, she answered it. "Ada," the voice whispered, "I'm here. Just look behind you." Ada's blood ran cold. Slowly she turned around, her eyes scanning the dimly lit room. The shadows seemed to shift, to move closer, enveloping her in darkness. She backed away, her hands shaking, but there was nothing, no one there. But then, she felt it, a presence behind her, so close she could feel its breath on her neck. Ada's scream echoed through the empty apartment, but it was cut short as she turned to face the presence. The line went dead, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. In the days that followed, Ada's apartment remained eerily silent. The phone call stopped, and the haunting presence seemed to vanish, leaving her in a state of uneasy calm. But the damage was done. Ada knew she was being watched, even if she couldn't see by whom. The peace she once felt in the quiet hours of the night was gone, replaced by a gnawing fear that would never truly leave her. And so, Ada lived with the knowledge that somewhere out there, someone was watching waiting, and the midnight caller could strike again at any moment. The silence that once brought her comfort now filled her with dread, as she realized that some secrets are too dark to stay hidden, and some fears too deep to ever escape. Ada's life would never be the same, forever shadowed by the fear of the unknown, by the memory of those calls and the voice that whispered in the dead of night. And as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, she could only wonder when, not if, the midnight caller would return. Don't forget to subscribe, share and like this video, because that will help us post more wonderful stories like this.